Okay, so I'm going to be talking about why journalistic objectivity is a misguided goal. So firstly, the recent rise of media bias. You've probably noticed that since the election of President Trump, there's been a pretty noticeable increase in accusations of things like bias and partisanship and fake news and all of that. This is actually part of a larger trend which has been going on since 1989 of increase in media bias over time. And so you can see that right now, 45% of Americans see a great deal of bias in news coverage. And this is a problem because if nearly half of Americans don't trust the media, something's going wrong because the purpose of the media is to honestly inform the public, right? And so if we want to protect our democratic process and stay informed, it's important to figure out what's going on here and examine the nature of media bias and objectivity. So first of all, is objectivity even a practical goal? And the answer is no, and that's because journalists are always making value judgments. Dutch journalist Rob Wijnberg makes the point that just by deciding to report on something, journalists are making the subjective judgment that that is an important topic. And so you can see this manifest in the situation described by Columbia University professor Leila Abu-Lughod, in which following 9/11, many American journalists, because of their sort of Western biases and perceptions of the Middle East, sought to know more about Muslim women, even though, as Lughod argues, Muslim women isn't really a relevant topic to 9/11. And even more recently, in the 2016 election, you saw a similar idea emerge in what was called the Bernie blackout, which was basically when many Bernie Sanders supporters thought that Bernie Sanders wasn't getting the amount of media coverage that he ought to have been getting. And so you had people on one side who thought that the media was biased against Sanders, and then you had people who said that the Bernie blackout wasn't really a thing and that Sanders just wasn't important enough to get the amount of coverage that his supporters wanted him to get. And so you can see how this demonstrates that inherent in journalism is making these judgments of what's important and how that's often perceived as bias. And Arthur Schlesinger, in The Historian as a Participant, makes a similar point by saying that from his perspective as a historian, whenever you report a historical event, you do so through your own interpretation, and that no interpretation can really be said to be truer or more objective than another. Okay, so if objectivity isn't really a practical goal, is it a desirable goal that we should still try to reach? The answer is also no, because if you look back at the original purpose of journalism from the perspective of the founding fathers, they thought that journalism was a vital part of the system of checks and balances, and that it was the duty of journalists to go out and criticize those in power whenever they did something unethical or abused their position, right? And so the point was, the purpose of journalism was to denounce wrongdoing. And you can see how this causes some problems when you try to insert objectivity into the mix. As Yale lecturer and journalist Linda Greenhouse describes, currently there's this struggle between the media trying to be objective while at the same time knowing how to react to a president who says a lot of unfounded things. Because, obviously, let's say that Trump says something that's just factually incorrect, they should go out and point that out. But when they do that, all of a sudden they're called biased and partisan and unobjective, right? And so you can see how objectivity sort of hinders journalists from doing what they're supposed to do, which is very dangerous for democracy and obviously should be avoided. Okay, so what would be a better solution to all of this media bias and distrust than just calling for objectivity? Firstly, it's important to establish that most of the media tends to lean towards the left. And this is important because it leads many Republicans and conservatives to feel like they're being excluded and alienated, and they say that, and it leads them to distrust the media. And if you look at the actual data, you can see that most of the media distrust and perceived bias is coming from conservatives and Republicans. And you can see that they stand out in this chart. And this is important because it shows that the problem isn't that there's just a lot of bias, but rather that there's bias, but only in a certain direction. And you can, if you look at the distribution of journalistic jobs, you can see that most of them are clustered in blue states, which further exacerbates the problem. And so a solution to this would not be to make individual journalists more objective, but it would be to make the media as a whole more fair and balanced. And so you can do this through more competition and decentralized media. And this can be done by the government in a variety of ways. Firstly, the government should encourage the growth of smaller media outlets. This can be done through various incentives or funding programs. Secondly, the government should break media monopolies and ensure that a few media networks aren't dominating the media. Thirdly, the government should help to ensure diversity of political views, so like forbidding hiring discrimination based on politics and things of that sort. And lastly, the government should be more involved in regulating censorship of unpopular political views. Now, there are some obvious limitations to this solution. Firstly, obviously, government regulation of the media could always be seen as violation of the First Amendment, so it's necessary to be careful when implementing that. Next, discrimination based on political views is quite hard to detect, so that might be a little difficult to implement. And lastly, this solution is gradual and won't happen overnight, and so making a more fair and balanced media through the government is going to take a while, but it's still a better solution than calling for the impractical goal of more objectivity. Thank you.
So let me ask you 2 questions. All right, so what additional information, what other questions emerged as you were going through this process, and why are those questions important?
So when I was doing my research, I came across this article about Facebook and confirmation bias on Facebook, and how a lot of people in their feed, they only see things that they agree with. I think that would relate to my topic, but I didn't include it. And so I would like to research that some more, and I have some questions about how that confirmation bias influences this topic of perceived media bias. And yeah, I think that would be important to include because it's another factor that affects the situation.
All right, so how did you handle the different perspectives to reach this conclusion?
So a lot of my perspectives, mainly I just looked at the different perspectives and found what they had in common. And oftentimes I thought that made my argument more stronger because it showed that even people coming from different points of view could have the same conclusion. Like I had one article that was from this scientist who talked about media bias in scientific papers, which I thought was really interesting because I never thought of it that way. I thought that scientific papers were the least likely to have bias. So.
All right.